Before there was a fallen world, before grief, before war among nations, before the first grave was ever dug into the earth, before humanity learned what fear felt like in the dark, there was a realm untouched by decay. No shadow stretched across its horizon. No lie had ever been spoken there. No rebellion had ever broken the harmony of its order. Heaven stood in perfect alignment with the will of its creator, alive with beauty beyond language, radiant with a glory no human eye could fully bear. Everything existed in its rightful place, and every being within that realm knew joy, because every being knew the one from whom joy flows. And among the countless hosts of heaven, among ranks of beings whose power would overwhelm mortal imagination, there was one who stood above the rest in splendor. Long before the name Satan became associated with accusation, hatred, and ruin, there existed a being described in language so elevated that generations of readers recognized something more than an earthly king hidden within the words. In the book of Ezekiel, while addressing the ruler of Tyre, the prophet suddenly begins speaking in imagery no ordinary man could fulfill. He speaks of one who was in Eden, the garden of God, one adorned with precious stones, one called the anointed cherub who covers, one who walked among fiery stones on the holy mountain of God. This was not the language of a merchant prince or political ruler alone. It pointed beyond the visible world toward a deeper rebellion behind human thrones. Imagine a created being fashioned at the peak of divine artistry. Beauty not borrowed from cosmetics or clothing, but woven into his very being. Wisdom not learned slowly through error, but granted in fullness from the day of creation. Authority, honor, access, brilliance, privilege, gifts poured out in measure beyond any other creature. He was surrounded by the light of God and reflected that light like a polished jewel beneath the sun. The text names stone after stone as part of his adornment. Sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, carbuncle. It reads almost like the inventory of a sanctuary, because this being himself was like a living treasury of glory. He did not merely wear beauty, he embodied it, and he was not distant from the throne. The title cherub carries weight. In the language of the ancient world, cherubim were guardians of sacred space. They appear at Eden's gate after humanity's exile, stationed where no fallen hand may reach the tree of life. They appear overshadowing the mercy seat in the tabernacle, wings extended over the place where divine presence was revealed. They were not random heavenly creatures. They were associated with nearness, holiness, and protection. To be called the anointed cherub who covers suggests rank of the highest order, not standing in the outer courts, not serving from afar, but near the blazing center of glory itself. There are moments in Scripture where even prophets collapse under a glimpse of heaven. Isaiah cried out in dread when he saw the Lord high and lifted up. Ezekiel fell on his face. Daniel lost all strength. John became as a dead man before the risen Christ. Yet this being moved in that realm as his appointed sphere of service. He walked among fiery stones, a phrase suggesting proximity to the unbearable brightness of God's holy presence. He had what every proud heart on earth has sought in fragments: status, beauty, intelligence, influence, admiration, privilege, and access. And still, it was not enough. That is one of the oldest lessons in all reality. Abundance cannot satisfy a heart that turns away from gratitude. There are people who imagine that if they only had more wealth, more beauty, more recognition, more opportunity, more control, then rest would finally arrive. But heaven's first rebel had all of it except one thing. He was not God. He was magnificent, but not self-existent. He was glorious, but not the source of glory. He was wise, but not wisdom itself. He shone, but he did not generate the light he carried. Everything he possessed was gift. And somewhere in the mystery of creaturely freedom, that truth became unbearable to him. Scripture gives one of the most tragic phrases ever written. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, until unrighteousness was found in you. Until a single word dividing perfection from catastrophe. Until there was no flaw. Until there was no corruption. Until there was no rebellion. Until the first fracture opened, not in matter, not in governments, not in nature, but in the will of a created being. No tempter approached him. No serpent whispered in his ear. No suffering drove him to bitterness. No injustice pushed him toward revenge. Evil did not begin as a reaction to oppression. It began in the heart of one who had every reason to rejoice. That matters more than many realize. We often explain wrongdoing by pointing outward. Circumstances, pressure, pain, opportunity, influence, and those things can shape choices. But the first rebellion in the biblical story did not arise from deprivation. It arose from pride. The New Testament hints at this when Paul warns leaders not to be lifted up with conceit and fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Conceit, pride, self-exaltation, the ancient pattern repeated in every generation. How does pride work? It begins quietly. It does not always announce itself with arrogance. Often it starts with fixation, a gaze turned inward too long, admiration of gifts slowly detached from the giver, appreciation mutating into entitlement. The anointed cherub could see his own beauty. He could feel his own power. He could recognize his own excellence. None of that was sinful by itself. Truth is not evil, but somewhere he crossed the invisible line between recognizing what had been given and claiming ownership of what belonged ultimately to another. He forgot the difference between reflection and source. That same temptation lives everywhere now. A talented mind begins to believe intelligence makes them self-made. A successful person begins to believe prosperity proves superiority. A beautiful person begins to treat admiration as tribute rightly owed. A religious person begins to mistake grace for personal greatness. The pattern is ancient because the first rebel walked it before humans existed. And once gratitude dies, comparison is born. If the heart is no longer thankful for what it has received, it begins resenting what it has not received. That is why the rebellion of heaven was never really about territory. It was about throne, not a location, a claim. Who will be highest? Who will define reality? Who will receive ultimate allegiance? Who will stand at the center? The creature wanted what belongs only to the Creator. Isaiah preserves the internal manifesto of that revolt in 5 devastating declarations. They are among the most revealing lines in Scripture because they expose the anatomy of all rebellion, whether angelic or human. I will ascend into heaven. At first this sounds strange. He was already in heavenly realms. So this was not about geography. It was about elevation beyond a assigned place. It was dissatisfaction with limits. It was refusal to remain what he was created to be. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. The stars often symbolize heavenly beings in biblical imagery. This was not enough to be honored among others. He wanted supremacy over others. Pride never rests with private self-love. It seeks hierarchy. It wants comparison to end in victory. I will sit on the mount of assembly. This is the language of rule, counsel, dominion. He did not want beauty alone. He wanted authority. He wanted the seat where decrees are made. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. Throughout Scripture, clouds are linked with divine majesty and presence. To rise above them is symbolic language for transcending even manifested glory, reaching beyond all boundaries of creaturehood. Then the final statement removes every disguise. I will be like the Most High. There it is. The center of sin in naked form. Not merely to enjoy God. Not merely to serve God. Not merely to resemble God morally, but to rival God in status. To possess independence. To claim equality. To enthrone self. Every lesser sin echoes this deeper one. Whenever the human heart says, my desire above truth, my will above righteousness, my judgment above God's word, my identity self created and answerable to none, the ancient cry returns. I will be like the Most High. But reality cannot be remade by ambition. The distance between creature and creator is not a ladder to climb. It is the difference between dependent and self-existent, between made and unmade, between one who receives breath and the one from whom breath comes. Pride cannot erase that boundary. It can only collide with it. And when pride collides with reality, destruction follows. This is why Proverbs says pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. It is not arbitrary punishment. It is consequence. To live against reality is to shatter upon it. The tragedy becomes even sharper when contrasted with Christ. The rebel angel, though created, grasped upward toward equality with God. But the Son of God, eternally divine, did not cling to privilege. He humbled himself, took the form of a servant, and became obedient unto death. One movement says, I will rise by taking. The other says, I will descend by giving. One births ruin. The other births redemption. The first rebel lost paradise because he would not bow. The true king entered suffering because he chose to love. And so the being once associated with brightness began to darken from within. The name Lucifer, drawn from later Latin tradition meaning light bearer, captures the irony. A bearer of light who turned from light itself. A radiant being becoming the architect of shadow. He still possessed power. He still possessed intelligence. He still possessed influence. But now every gift bent toward revolt. That too is a sobering truth. Corruption often does not destroy ability. It redirects ability toward evil ends. A brilliant mind can build lies. A charismatic voice can lead crowds into ruin. Strength can become oppression. Beauty can become manipulation. Wisdom severed from worship becomes cunning. The heavenly rebel did not cease being formidable when he fell. He became dangerous, and he was not alone for long. Rebellion spreads because pride is persuasive. The dissatisfied heart often seeks company. It validates itself by recruiting others. If enough voices join the lie begins to feel like truth. Somehow, in ways Scripture only partially unveils, this exalted being persuaded others among the heavenly host to follow him. Later imagery in Revelation speaks of a third of the stars swept with the dragon. Whether understood symbolically or literally, the message is clear. Many joined the revolt. Think of the madness of it. Created beings sustained by God's power, using that very power against him. Dependent lives declaring independence. Finite minds imagining victory over infinite wisdom. It is irrational, and yet sin often is. People destroy marriages for passing thrills. Nations choose war over peace. Souls trade integrity for applause. Addictions consume those who know better. Rebellion does not need to make sense to become catastrophic. By now, the atmosphere of heaven itself had changed. Not because God lost control, not because evil rivaled him as equal force, but because freedom had been used to reject love. The realm of harmony now contained treason. The realm of worship now faced blasphemy. The realm of peace now stood on the edge of war. And soon another name would rise into the story. Michael. His name means, who is like God? Not a boast, a question, a challenge, a refutation of every proud claim. Who is like God? Not the most adorned cherub, not the brightest angel, not the strongest ruler, not any power in heaven or earth. The coming conflict would answer that question before all creation. But before swords of judgment, before expulsion, before the dragons fall to earth, the deepest battle had already been fought in secret, inside the will. That is where all wars begin. Not first on battlefields, not first in headlines, not first with armies, but in desires, loyalties, loves, and ambitions. The first battlefield in the biblical story was a heart that ceased to be content with worship. And because of that unseen victory of pride, all visible tragedies would follow. The stage was now set for the war in heaven. The moment rebellion moved from thought into action, heaven was no longer a realm of unified worship. What had once been perfect alignment now contained division. Not because God had changed, but because created will had turned against its source. Scripture describes it in compressed language. but the reality behind it, as ancient tradition and biblical imagery present it, is immense in scale. What began as pride inside a single exalted being did not remain isolated. Influence spread, loyalty fractured, and what Revelation later symbolically describes as a great dragon drawing a portion of the stars of heaven with him captures this moment of collapse in heavenly order. The image is not of a quiet disagreement. It is of a cosmic rupture, where beings who once moved in harmony with divine will now align themselves around a competing center of authority. At the heart of it stands a figure now known as the adversary, the one who had said, "I will be like the Most High." That declaration was not just internal ambition. It became the foundation of a counter-kingdom, an opposing will within creation itself. And once that will formed, separation became inevitable. The book of Revelation describes what follows in symbolic but forceful terms. War broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. The first thing to understand is that this is not war in the human sense. It is not physical struggle between bodies. Scripture does not give us mechanics of how spiritual beings engage in conflict. Instead, it gives us outcome language, authority language, and allegiance language. This is a clash between loyalty and rebellion, between order and disruption, between divine purpose and self-exalting will. Michael appears here not as a rival god, but as a commander acting under divine authority. His very name, who is like God, stands as a living contradiction to the rebel's claim. Where pride says, "I will be like God," Michael's existence answers, "No one is like God." Every movement in this confrontation carries theological meaning. The dragon, identified elsewhere as the serpent, the accuser, Satan, represents not only a being, but a position taken against divine rule. And he does not stand alone. He brings with him angels who align themselves with his rebellion. Scripture does not explain the moment of their decision in detail, but it presents the result clearly. Allegiance was divided, and a portion of the heavenly host chose autonomy over submission. It is important to recognize what is being rejected in this moment. It is not suffering that caused rebellion, not injustice, not deprivation. These beings, as portrayed in the tradition, exist in fullness of provision. They are not driven by hunger or need. The rebellion is not reactive. It is volitional. It is the choice of will over worship. That is what makes it so serious in biblical thought. It is rebellion from within perfection. The text says they fought, but then immediately emphasizes something crucial. They were not strong enough. That statement is not just about power. It is about reality itself. Created beings, no matter how exalted, do not possess independent self-sustaining authority. Their existence, their strength, their being is continuously derived. To turn against the source of that existence is to disconnect from the very foundation that sustains them. So the conflict is not balanced. It is not two equal forces competing for dominance. Scripture consistently avoids framing it that way. Instead, it presents the outcome as inevitable once rebellion defines itself. The dragon and his angels cannot prevail, not because they are insignificant, but because they're dependent beings attempting to function as independent powers. And so heaven responds not with chaos, but with decisive separation. There is a moment described as removal, as expulsion. They're no longer found in their place. The language used in Revelation is vivid. There is no longer any place found for them in heaven. That phrase is not just spatial. It is relational. It means they no longer belong within the order of harmony that defines heaven's reality. What follows is described as being cast down. Again, the language is not gentle. It is not negotiated exile. It is forceful removal from a realm where rebellion cannot coexist with holiness. The idea is simple but absolute. Heaven cannot contain contradiction to itself. A realm defined by perfect alignment with God cannot permanently host those who define themselves against him. So the dragon is cast down, and with him those who followed his path. At this point, the text identifies him in layered terms. That ancient serpent, called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. Each title reveals a function. Serpent connects him to deception in Eden. Devil identifies him as accuser and slanderer. Satan defines him as adversary. Together, they form a complete portrait of opposition. He lies, he accuses, and he resists. And now, according to this tradition, his domain is no longer heaven but earth. This shift is extremely important in the biblical narrative. It does not mean he becomes ruler in the sense of rightful authority. It means he becomes active in a new sphere, one already prepared for the next stage of the conflict. Earth, in the Genesis account, is not originally a battlefield. It is a place of life, order, cultivation, and communion between humanity and God. But now, with rebellion expelled from heaven, the conflict moves downward into the created world. The war does not end. It relocates. And this is where the narrative becomes deeply connected to humanity. Because humanity is introduced into a world already carrying the aftermath of a cosmic rebellion. Adam and Eve do not enter a neutral environment. They enter a creation where the question of authority has already been challenged in the unseen realm. The adversary, now operating within earthly boundaries, does not approach immediately with force. He does what he always does in biblical presentation. He speaks. The form he takes is that of a serpent. The text in Genesis describes this creature as more cunning than any beast of the field that the Lord God had made. But behind the form stands the same intelligence, the same will, the same strategy that once spoke in heaven with "I will" declarations. And now the target is different. Not angels, not heavenly ranks, but human beings. The strategy, however, remains consistent. The weakening of trust in divine word. The first recorded question is not an open attack. It is subtle. Did God actually say? This is the same pattern as the heavenly rebellion, but now translated into human language. In heaven, it was dissatisfaction with position. On earth, it becomes doubt about instruction. In both cases, the underlying move is the same, separating the created will from trust in the Creator's authority. The question itself is carefully designed. It does not outright deny God's command. It reframes it. It introduces uncertainty. It shifts focus from clarity to interpretation. And once certainty is disturbed, the ground beneath obedience begins to weaken. The woman responds, but in her response, something small yet significant appears. She repeats the command, but adds a detail not recorded in the original instruction. Not only must they not eat, but they must not even touch the tree. This is subtle, but in the logic of the narrative it shows something important. Once divine instruction is filtered through human retelling under pressure, boundaries can shift. The clarity of command becomes slightly altered, slightly expanded, slightly unstable. That instability is enough for the next step. The direct contradiction comes, "You will not surely die." This is the first explicit denial, and it is followed immediately by reinterpretation of motive. God is not protecting you, the serpent implies. God is withholding something from you. God knows something you should have. This is crucial in understanding the nature of temptation as presented in this tradition. The adversary does not begin by offering evil as evil. He presents disobedience as elevation. He reframes rebellion as advancement. He reframes limitation as oppression. It is the same core logic that existed in the heavenly rebellion. There too, the suggestion was not become evil, but become like God. Now it is repeated in a different form. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. The appeal is identity, knowledge, expansion. And this is where the biblical narrative connects heaven and earth into one continuous conflict. The same pattern that fractured the heavenly order now enters human experience. The desire to move beyond creaturely trust becomes the point of rupture again. The text then slows down at the moment of choice. The woman sees the fruit as desirable, good for food, pleasing to the eye, desirable for gaining wisdom. These categories are important in the narrative structure. It is not only physical appetite. It is aesthetic appeal and intellectual ambition combined. Desire touches body, perception, and mind all at once. And then the action is described in the simplest possible terms. She took and ate. No dramatic explanation follows in that moment. No resistance is recorded. Just the transition from consideration to action. Then the man, who is with her, also eats. This detail is often noted in interpretation because it indicates shared responsibility in the act. The narrative does not present him as distant or unaware. He is present in the moment of decision. And with that, the pattern of rebellion that began in heaven now takes root in humanity. The immediate result is not physical death in the instant sense, but altered perception. They realize they are naked. Shame enters experience for the first time. Covering becomes necessary. Hiding becomes instinctive. And when the presence of God is heard in the garden, the response is no longer joy, but fear. This is the consequence of broken trust, separation, not only from command, but from communion. The same structure that removed the rebel angels from heaven now manifests in human experience as expulsion from innocence into awareness of loss. And yet, even here, the narrative does not end in silence, because what follows will introduce something unexpected inside judgment itself. A promise that the conflict is not permanent defeat, but a prolonged war moving toward resolution. After the moment of disobedience, the garden is no longer the same. Nothing about the physical world has changed yet in appearance, but everything in the relationship between creator and creation has shifted. The sound of God walking in the garden, which once represented joy and fellowship, now becomes something that causes fear. The humans who once moved freely in his presence now hide among the trees. That detail is important because it shows the immediate effect of broken trust. The first instinct after rebellion is concealment, not restoration, not return, but hiding. The creature who was made for communion now avoids the presence of the one who gives life. And yet the text shows something deeply consistent with the entire biblical narrative. God initiates contact. Where are you? It is not a question of information. It is a question that exposes condition. It draws what is hidden into the light. It forces awareness of separation. The humans answer, and in their answer, the consequences of disobedience become visible. Fear has entered. Shame has entered. Blame has entered. The man responds first by shifting responsibility. The woman responds next by shifting responsibility. And then the serpent is identified as the source of deception. Each participant in the act stands within the reality of consequence, yet none fully owns the weight of their choice in a complete way. This pattern, once introduced, will echo through all human history. Then the focus moves to the serpent. The judgment pronounced there is layered. On the surface, it addresses the creature used as the form of deception. But beneath that, it speaks to the power behind it, the adversary who initiated rebellion long before this moment in Eden. The serpent is told that it will move in humiliation, that enmity will exist between it and humanity, between its seed and the seed of the woman. This is where the narrative shifts from explanation of the past to projection into the future. Because what is introduced here is not only punishment, but ongoing conflict. Enmity means sustained hostility, not a single moment of opposition, but a continuing struggle across generations. This is the beginning of the biblical framework for understanding human history as more than political or social development. It becomes a moral and spiritual conflict woven through time. Then comes one of the most studied and most significant lines in the entire text. The declaration that the offspring of the woman will crush the serpent's head, while the serpent will strike at the heel. The imagery is simple but decisive. The head represents authority, control, and final defeat. A blow to the head is fatal, ending the power of the opponent. The heel represents vulnerability, a place of injury, but not ultimate destruction. So the structure of the statement already contains asymmetry. One wound is permanent. The other is painful, but not final. This is not merely poetic language. In the traditional interpretation of the biblical narrative, This is the first announcement that the conflict introduced in heaven and extended into Eden will not end in endless balance between opposing forces. It will end in resolution, and that resolution will come through human history itself. The seed of the woman becomes a key thread that runs through the entire biblical story. It is not defined immediately in detail, but it introduces expectation. It creates direction. It implies that humanity, though now fallen, is not abandoned as irrelevant to the unfolding plan. From this point onward, the narrative of Scripture repeatedly follows that line of promise through generations, tracing survival, conflict, preservation, and repeated attempts to destroy or corrupt that line. But before any of that unfolds, the immediate consequences of the fall continue. The woman is told that pain will enter childbirth, that what was once naturally part of life will now carry suffering. The man is told that the ground itself will resist him, that work will become marked by frustration, effort, and limitation. The world does not become evil in essence, but it becomes resistant, broken in harmony, no longer aligned smoothly with human intention. This is important because it shows that the consequences of rebellion extend beyond the internal moral sphere. They affect relationships, environment, labor, and physical experience. The entire created order is described as having been subjected to futility in later biblical language. Then comes the sentence that defines mortality in human experience: return to dust. Life is no longer presented as continuous earthly existence. It is now marked by an ending point. The creature formed from dust returns to dust. And yet, even in this moment of judgment, something remarkable happens in the narrative tone. The harshness of consequence is not the final word. There is a shift toward preservation. The humans are clothed. The text describes God making garments for them, covering their shame. This act is small in comparison to the magnitude of the fall, yet it carries meaning. It shows that even in judgment, there is provision. Even in consequence, there is care. The humans are not abandoned in their exposed condition. Then comes a crucial moment in the narrative structure: expulsion from the garden. They are sent out from Eden, from the place where direct access to the tree of life existed. The reason given is not arbitrary punishment, but prevention of a condition where fallen humanity would live forever in a state of separation. The garden is guarded, and access to the tree of life is restricted. Cherubim are placed there, along with a flaming sword that turns in every direction. This image connects directly back to the earlier descriptions of cherubim as guardians of sacred space. Beings associated with the presence of God now stand at the boundary of Eden, marking the transition between innocence and exile. This is the first physical manifestation of separation between humanity and direct access to divine presence in the biblical story. But the narrative does not end with expulsion. It continues immediately into the next generation, and with it, the unfolding of the conflict introduced in Eden begins to take visible shape among humans. Cain and Abel represent the first recorded expression of the divided human condition. One offering is accepted, the other is not. The text does not fully explain all the mechanics behind the acceptance, but what follows is clear. The external difference in outcome becomes internal conflict. Cain becomes angry. His countenance falls, and God warns him that sin is crouching at the door, desiring to master him. This language is striking because it personifies sin as something active, waiting, ready to dominate if given opportunity. It echoes the earlier deception pattern, where desire becomes the entry point for disobedience. But Cain does not overcome it. Instead, he acts, and he kills his brother. For the first time in the biblical narrative, human death caused by human hands enters the story. What began as spiritual separation now becomes physical violence. The conflict introduced in heaven, extended in Eden, now manifests in human relationships in the most extreme form possible: fratricide. The seed of rebellion produces its first visible fruit in human society. And yet even here, the pattern of divine engagement continues. Cain is confronted. He is asked about his brother. He responds with denial and evasion. And then he is judged, not with immediate destruction, but with exile and wandering. Again, the pattern repeats: separation, removal, displacement. But the story is not simply moving toward despair, because alongside the growth of corruption, another line continues. The line of promise does not disappear. It moves through generations, often quietly, often under pressure, but it continues. Adam and Eve have another son, Seth, and from him a new line begins to form. The text briefly notes that at this time, people begin to call on the name of the Lord. That detail suggests that even in a world now marked by division and violence, worship and recognition of God's authority continue. The conflict is now clearly established in two directions. One direction moves toward increasing rebellion, violence, and distortion of the created order. The other moves toward preservation of worship, trust, and continuity of the divine promise. This dual movement will shape everything that follows in the biblical narrative. Generations pass. Civilizations begin to form. Human capability grows, but so does corruption. The text will later describe the earth becoming filled with violence, a condition so severe that divine judgment in the form of a flood becomes part of the story. But even before that judgment arrives, the pattern introduced in heaven and revealed in Eden continues to expand. Rebellion leads to separation. Separation leads to distortion. And distortion leads to crisis. And yet, through every stage, the thread of promise remains present. The seed of the woman has not disappeared. The adversary has not achieved final victory. The story is still in motion. As generations continue after Cain and Seth, the biblical narrative begins to show something consistent and increasingly heavy. Humanity is not moving toward harmony on its own. Instead, the same pattern introduced in Eden spreads outward through families, cities, and civilizations. The inward fracture of trust becomes outward fracture in society. The line of Cain builds cities. Civilization begins to grow. Skills develop. Livelihoods expand. Culture emerges. Human beings become capable of shaping the world around them in new and complex ways. This is not presented as evil in itself. Building cities, developing tools, forming culture are part of human capacity. But alongside this development, something else grows at the same time: violence, pride, and detachment from the Creator. In the biblical framing, progress without alignment does not produce stability. It produces escalation. The descendants of Cain are described as advancing in arts and industry. Names appear connected to livestock, music, and metalwork. These details matter because they show that human creativity remains active even after the fall. Music is developed. Tools are forged. Society organizes itself. Life is not collapsing into silence or inactivity. It is becoming more advanced, more structured, more capable. But capability does not equal righteousness. At the same time, moral corruption deepens. The text introduces patterns of violence that begin to define human interaction. The world that once began in a garden of peace is now marked by increasing disorder among people. In contrast, the line of Seth represents another direction. It is from this line that people begin to call on the name of the Lord. That phrase signals something important in the narrative. Dependence returns in the midst of decline. Worship continues even as corruption spreads. The story is no longer about a single unified direction for humanity. It becomes divided between those who pursue self-defined order and those who continue to acknowledge divine authority. This division is not presented as purely genetic or social. It is theological. It is about orientation of the heart. As time progresses, the separation between these two lines becomes more pronounced, and the narrative introduces one of the most debated and symbolically dense passages in the early chapters of Genesis: the increase of wickedness on the earth and the emergence of beings described as the sons of God and the daughters of men. The text is brief, but its implications are vast in interpretation history. It describes a period when boundaries that had once held structure in human existence begin to blur. The result is described as corruption spreading through the earth and violence filling it. The language used is totalizing. It does not describe isolated wrongdoing. It describes saturation. The earth is filled with violence. Human imagination is continually inclined toward evil. The condition is not temporary failure, but systemic breakdown. In this context, the biblical narrative presents a deeply important statement. God sees the condition of humanity and responds. This is not presented as distant observation. It is relational awareness. The Creator is not detached from what has unfolded. He sees the trajectory of human behavior and its consequences within creation itself. And the conclusion is stated with solemn weight. The earth is corrupted. But even in this description of widespread collapse, one figure is highlighted: Noah. He is described as righteous, blameless in his generation, someone who walks with God. In the midst of a world moving in one direction, Noah represents continuity with a different direction. He is not presented as perfect in a modern sense of moral flawlessness, but as aligned with God in contrast to the surrounding corruption. This contrast is crucial. It shows that even when widespread decline occurs, alignment with God is still possible within human existence. The presence of righteousness does not require a perfect environment. It can exist even in a deteriorating one. Then the narrative reaches a turning point: divine decision regarding judgment. The text describes that the earth is filled with violence, and that all flesh has corrupted its way. The language emphasizes universality. This is not localized failure. It is global condition within the scope of the ancient narrative world. The decision is made to bring a flood upon the earth, to cleanse the corruption that has overtaken creation. But even here, judgment is not the only element. Instruction accompanies it. Noah is given specific guidance to build an ark. Detailed dimensions are provided. Materials are specified. The structure itself becomes a means of preservation. This is a recurring pattern in the biblical story. Judgment is never presented without a pathway of preservation for those aligned with divine instruction. The ark represents separation between two realities. One reality continues in corruption and is subject to judgment. The other enters into obedience and is preserved through the coming disruption. At this point, the narrative also reintroduces the broader spiritual background. The corruption of the earth is not portrayed as purely human self-development gone wrong. It is connected to a deeper history of rebellion that began in the unseen realm. The same adversarial force that spoke in Eden is understood to be active in influencing, deceiving, and accelerating corruption among humanity. This is important because it ties the flood narrative back into the larger arc of conflict that began with pride in heaven. The rebellion is no longer confined to one being or one event. It is now entangled with human history itself. As Noah builds the ark, life around him continues normally for others. That detail carries weight in the narrative tradition. It suggests that judgment does not arrive with constant visible warning in daily life. Instead, life can appear stable while deeper realities are forming beneath the surface. This is why the text emphasizes obedience over perception. Noah acts according to instruction even when the surrounding culture does not reflect the same understanding. Then the flood comes. The narrative describes waters breaking forth from below and above, language that conveys total coverage of the known world in the story's framework. The structure of creation is overwhelmed by water, reversing the separation between waters above and waters below, described in Genesis 1. What was once ordered is now undone. This reversal is significant because it mirrors creation language in reverse order. The separation of waters that allowed life to exist is now collapsed. The boundaries that held creation in structure are removed. It is as if creation itself is being deconstructed back toward a pre-formed state. And yet the ark remains. The preservation of Noah and his family becomes the central point of continuity. Humanity is not erased. It is reset through a surviving line. After the waters recede, the earth emerges again, but it is not the same world in terms of human continuity. A new beginning is initiated. Noah builds an altar. Worship resumes. The covenantal relationship between God and humanity is reaffirmed in a renewed form. But the narrative also makes clear that the condition of the human heart has not fundamentally changed. The capacity for corruption remains present. The flood does not remove the internal inclination that led to the earlier violence. It restrains judgment, resets history, and preserves a line, but it does not eliminate the deeper struggle introduced in Eden. That deeper struggle continues. And from this point forward, the biblical story begins to focus not on universal corruption alone, but on the development of a chosen line through which the earlier promise, the seed of the woman who would ultimately confront the serpent, will move forward through history. After the floodwaters recede, the earth is quiet again in a way it had not been for generations. The violence that once filled the world has been judged, and Noah and his family step into a renewed landscape. In the biblical narrative, this moment feels like a reset of human history. The ground is washed, the corruption is removed, and a single family becomes the starting point of a new civilization. Noah builds an altar first. That detail is important because it shows that before expansion, before settlement, before ambition, there is acknowledgement. Worship is not presented as an afterthought, but as a foundation. The renewed world begins not with construction of cities, but with recognition of the one who preserved life through judgment. And then comes a repetition of earlier language, but with a new covenantal tone. God speaks to Noah and establishes a promise regarding creation itself. The rhythm of seasons, the stability of nature, the continuation of life, all of this is affirmed. Humanity is not being placed back into a garden, but into a world that will continue under divine order despite human imperfection. From Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the earth begins to repopulate. Nations begin to form. Families grow into clans, clans into peoples, and peoples into distinct groups. The biblical narrative traces this expansion not simply as demographic growth, but as the origin of cultural and linguistic diversity. At first, humanity shares a common language. This unity allows rapid cooperation. Skills, knowledge, and movement are shared without barrier. In a purely human sense, this could be seen as advancement toward collective strength. But in the logic of the biblical narrative, unity without alignment becomes a new stage for the same ancient problem. Pride expressed collectively rather than individually. As generations settle in the land of Shinar, a decision emerges that marks another turning point in the story. The people say to one another, in essence, that they will build something permanent, something visible, something that will prevent them from being scattered across the earth. Their intention reveals something subtle but significant. It is not merely construction. It is resistance to dispersion. It is an attempt to secure unity through human design rather than divine direction. The command given after the flood was to fill the earth, to spread, to expand outward. But now the human community begins to move in the opposite direction, toward concentration, centralization, and self-determined stability. They begin to build a city, and within that city, a tower. The narrative describes it as a structure reaching toward the heavens. In ancient symbolic language, this is not simply architectural ambition. It represents the desire to bridge the gap between earth and heaven through human effort alone. It is the continuation of the same impulse seen in Eden and in the rebellion of the heavenly figure, the desire to reach divine status or divine proximity without submission. The motivation is also stated clearly in the narrative logic. Let us make a name for ourselves. This phrase captures the heart of the issue. A name in biblical thought is not just identity. It represents reputation, authority, and enduring significance. To make a name is to construct legacy independent of divine granting. It is self-definition elevated to ultimate goal. This mirrors the earlier declarations of the heavenly rebel: self-exaltation, independence, elevation beyond assigned place. The pattern repeats, now on a human collective scale, But there is another motivation stated alongside it, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. This reveals resistance to divine instruction. After the flood, humanity was directed to spread and fill the earth. But now there is fear in dispersion. Unity becomes not cooperation and obedience, but protection against perceived loss of control. So the project begins. Brick is made. Mortar is prepared. Construction rises. A city forms. A tower grows upward. From a human perspective, this is technological and social achievement. From a narrative perspective, it is symbolic of a deeper spiritual posture. Humanity attempting to establish permanence, identity, and security without dependence on God's command. And then the text shifts perspective. It says that God observes the city and the tower being built by the sons of man. The language is simple but deliberate. The project that appears monumental to humans is described in a way that places it within divine observation without struggle or threat. There is no sense that heaven is endangered by the tower. Instead, there is assessment of direction. And what is seen is unity, but a unity directed towards self-exaltation and separation from divine instruction. The narrative then records divine response in strikingly human, accessible language. Let us go down. This phrase is often noted because it mirrors earlier plural language in Genesis. But within the narrative structure, it emphasizes divine engagement with human action. The movement is not reactionary fear. It is deliberate intervention. The result is the confusion of language. Suddenly, communication that once flowed freely becomes fragmented. Shared vocabulary becomes divided into multiple systems. Coordination breaks down. Understanding fractures. The very mechanism that enabled collective ambition is disrupted. The builders can no longer fully coordinate their project. The city cannot continue in its original unified form. The tower becomes incomplete. The project dissolves not through destruction, but through inability to communicate. And the place is named Babel, because there the language of the earth was confused. This moment is crucial in the larger biblical narrative because it explains the origin of national and linguistic division in theological terms. But it also carries a deeper symbolic meaning. It shows that when human unity is directed toward self-exaltation rather than obedience, it becomes unstable. It collapses not because unity itself is wrong, but because unity detached from alignment cannot sustain itself. The scattering that humanity tried to prevent becomes reality. The irony is significant. The people sought to avoid dispersion, but their method of resisting divine instruction results in exactly what they feared. They're scattered across the earth. The tower remains as a symbol of unfinished ambition. But the story does not end with failure alone. From this scattering emerges the formation of nations, cultures, and languages that will shape the next stage of the biblical narrative. Humanity is now spread across the earth, divided linguistically and geographically, each group developing its own identity. Yet beneath this dispersion, the deeper thread of the story continues uninterrupted. The promise introduced in Eden, the seed of the woman who would ultimately confront the serpent, has not been canceled. It has not been forgotten in the narrative logic of Scripture. Instead, it continues through specific lines of descent that will now become more defined in the following chapters. After Babel, the focus of the story narrows. From humanity as a whole, attention shifts toward one man, one lineage, one chosen direction through which the earlier promise will move forward. The world is now divided, but the conflict introduced at the beginning remains unified in purpose. The struggle between rebellion and divine intention continues across scattered nations. The earth is now filled with nations, languages, and cultures, all moving independently, each group developing its own direction. The unity that once existed before Babel is gone, replaced by fragmentation. But in the middle of that fragmentation, the story begins to focus on a single individual living in a land called Ur of the Chaldeans. His name is Abram, later known as Abraham. At this point in the narrative, there is nothing outwardly extraordinary about him in terms of global significance. He is not described as a ruler of empires or a conqueror of nations. He is part of a family line living in a post-Babel world, surrounded by the same scattered humanity that now fills the earth. And yet, within the biblical framework, this is where something very significant happens. God speaks again in a direct and defining way that will shape the rest of the story. The instruction is simple, but it carries enormous weight. Abram is told to leave his country, leave his people, and leave his father's household, and go to a land that will be shown to him. This moment is not just about geography. It is about separation. Just as earlier moments in the narrative involve separation. Light from darkness, waters above from waters below, humanity from Eden, Noah from the flood generation. Now a single man is called to separate from his known world entirely. It is a movement away from identity rooted in family, culture, and location, toward identity rooted in divine promise. And alongside the command comes a promise. Abram is told that he will become a great nation, that he will be blessed, that his name will be made great, and that through him all families of the earth will be blessed. This is significant because it directly echoes what humanity attempted at Babel. At Babel, people said, "Let us make a name for ourselves." Here, the promise is that a name will be made, but not through human self-exaltation. It will be granted through divine purpose. At Babel, humanity sought unity apart from obedience. Here, obedience becomes the pathway to a new kind of unity that will ultimately extend beyond one nation to all nations. Abram responds by leaving. He moves with his wife, his possessions, and those connected to him, traveling into a land unfamiliar to him. The narrative emphasizes that he goes without full knowledge of the destination. He is not operating with complete visibility of the future. He is operating on trust in the word that was spoken to him. This becomes one of the foundational themes of his entire life. Movement guided by promise rather than sight. As Abram enters the land of Canaan, the promise is repeated. The land itself is declared as something that will belong to his descendants. At this point, however, Abram has no children. This creates a tension in the narrative. A promise of descendants and land is given to someone who currently lacks the most basic element required for that promise to naturally unfold. This tension is not accidental in the story. It becomes the space in which trust is formed. Time passes, and Abram faces situations that test the stability of that trust. Famine arises in the land, leading him to go down to Egypt for a time. There are moments of fear, moments of uncertainty, moments where human strategy and divine promise appear to be in tension. Yet through these movements, the narrative continues to emphasize that the promise is not dependent on ideal conditions. It continues through instability. Eventually, Abram's separate from his relative Lot due to increasing tension between their households. Their possessions and flocks grow so large that the land cannot sustain both groups together. Once again, separation becomes a defining movement in the story. Lot chooses one region, and Abram remains in another. After this separation, the promise is reiterated again. The land will belong to Abram's descendants, and they will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. But still, Abram remains without a child. At this point, the narrative introduces conflict in a different form. Not external war, but internal uncertainty. Abram begins to question how the promise will be fulfilled. The tension between what has been spoken and what is visible becomes more intense. Then something significant happens in the story. Abram is told that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And the text states that he believes this promise, and that his belief is counted as righteousness. This moment becomes one of the central theological turning points in the entire biblical narrative. The relationship between human response and divine promise is defined not by achievement, but by trust. It is not performance that establishes alignment in this moment. It is belief in the word spoken. As the story continues, God establishes a covenant with Abram. The covenant involves a formalized promise regarding land, descendants, and future inheritance. It is described in symbolic terms involving sacrifice and a deep sense of solemn commitment. In the cultural context of ancient covenants, this kind of act represented binding agreement of the highest order. And in this covenant, God alone passes through the symbolic act, indicating that the fulfillment ultimately rests on divine commitment rather than mutual human capacity. As time continues, Abram and Sarai struggle with the reality of barrenness. Sarai suggests that Abram take Hagar, her servant, in order to produce an heir. This results in the birth of Ishmael. But the narrative makes clear that this is not the fulfillment of the original promise, but rather a human attempt to bring about what was promised through alternative means. This distinction becomes important in the unfolding story. Whenever human beings attempt to fulfill divine promises through independent strategy, the result creates complexity and tension rather than resolution. Later, the promise is clarified again. Sarai herself will bear a son. Her name is changed to Sarah, and Abram's name is changed to Abraham, reflecting the expansion of identity tied to the promise. Their new names signify that their lives are now defined by what has been spoken over them rather than what is currently visible in their circumstances. When Isaac is finally born, it represents the fulfillment of promise in a way that cannot be attributed to natural expectation alone. It is described as something that brings laughter because it arrives beyond normal human anticipation. The impossible has become reality, not through human control, but through divine intervention. At this stage in the narrative, two lines now exist within Abraham's household, Ishmael and Isaac. And the story begins to show that the conflict introduced earlier in Scripture, the division between promise and opposition, begins to take shape even within family structures. But the focus remains on Isaac as the continuation of the covenant line. As Abraham's story progresses, another major event occurs that further defines the nature of divine justice and moral order in the biblical narrative, the judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. These cities are described as having reached a level of moral corruption that becomes central to the narrative's understanding of societal breakdown. The text portrays a situation where injustice, violence, and moral distortion have become entrenched. Before judgment occurs, Abraham intercedes. He speaks to God in a series of appeals regarding the fate of the righteous within the city. This dialogue reveals something important about the narrative structure of justice. Judgment is not portrayed as arbitrary destruction, but as something weighed against righteousness. Even a small number of righteous people would have been sufficient, in Abraham's reasoning, to preserve the cities. But ultimately, the narrative indicates that such a threshold is not met. Lot and his family are removed from the city before destruction occurs, emphasizing again the recurring pattern of separation between those preserved by alignment and those removed by judgment. The cities are destroyed, and the narrative presents this as a consequence of accumulated corruption reaching a point of irreversible collapse. Yet even this moment of judgment is not the end of the story. Lot's survival preserves a line of descendants. Abraham continues forward in the covenant. Isaac grows and becomes the next carrier of promise. The narrative is building a continuous thread through generations, showing that despite repeated human failure, fragmentation, and moral collapse, the promise remains active and unbroken. Then comes one of the most significant tests in Abraham's life. He is asked to offer Isaac. This moment is one of the most discussed passages in the entire biblical tradition because it represents the deepest tension in the narrative so far. The promised son, the continuation of the covenant line, is now placed at the center of a command that appears to contradict the promise itself. Abraham proceeds to the designated place. The narrative describes the journey in deliberate detail. Wood is prepared. The altar is built. Isaac is present, carrying the wood that will be used for the offering. At a certain point, Isaac himself asks about the sacrifice, and Abraham responds that God will provide. At the moment of completion, as Abraham is about to act, he is stopped. A provision is given in place of Isaac. The narrative emphasizes that the son is preserved and that the promise continues through him. This moment reinforces a key theme that has been building since the beginning of the story. The promise does not depend on human control, even when obedience is tested to its absolute limit. It is sustained by divine commitment. After this, the covenant line continues through Isaac. The story will move into the next generation, into Jacob, into the formation of Israel as a people, and into the continued unfolding of the conflict between promise and opposition across history. But at this stage, the foundation is set clearly. A chosen line has been established. A promise is moving through history. After Abraham's final tested obedience and the reaffirmation of the covenant through Isaac, the story does not expand outward again. Instead, it narrows. The biblical narrative begins to focus less on large-scale events and more on family tension, inheritance, and the continuation of promise through specific choices within a single household. Isaac, the son of promise, marries Rebekah. And like the pattern seen before with Sarah, Rebekah also experiences barrenness for a time. The repetition is intentional within the narrative structure. It reinforces a recurring theme. The promised line does not continue through natural ease or predictable human progression. It continues through situations where human limitation is evident and divine intervention becomes necessary. When Rebekah eventually conceives, something unusual is described. The children struggle within her womb. This is not a simple pregnancy narrative. It is presented as internal conflict before birth, a symbolic foreshadowing of division that will define their lives. She is told that two nations are within her, and that two peoples will be separated from her body. One will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. This statement is extremely important in the flow of the biblical narrative because it reverses expected cultural order. In ancient Near Eastern tradition, the firstborn held priority in inheritance, authority, and blessing. But here, before the children are even born, the order is already redefined. The direction of the covenant does not follow human expectation or cultural norm. When the children are born, the first is Esau, described as red and hairy, a skilled hunter who lives close to the wilderness. The second is Jacob, who is born grasping Esau's heel. Even at birth, the imagery suggests tension, struggle, and pursuit. The names themselves reflect character themes within the narrative. Esau becomes associated with impulsive physicality and immediate gratification. Jacob becomes associated with grasping, striving, and strategic pursuit. As they grow, the contrast between them becomes clearer. Isaac favors Esau because of his hunting skills and the food he brings. Rebekah favors Jacob. Division enters the household not only between the brothers, but also between parental preferences, creating a fractured family environment. One day, Esau returns from the field exhausted and hungry. Jacob is preparing food. Esau asks for some of it, and Jacob responds by offering it in exchange for Esau's birthright. In that moment, Esau agrees. The text describes him as valuing immediate satisfaction over long-term inheritance. He sells his birthright for a meal. This moment becomes symbolic in the biblical narrative. It represents the exchange of lasting value for immediate desire. It is not just about food. It is about priority. The birthright represents inheritance, identity, and covenant continuity. Esau's decision reflects a pattern where present need overrides future significance. Later, the story intensifies when Isaac grows old and prepares to bless his sons. The blessing in this context is not merely a spoken wish. It carries covenantal weight, representing authority and continuation of promise. Rebekah intervenes in the process, guiding Jacob to receive the blessing instead of Esau. Through a series of actions involving disguise and deception, Jacob receives the blessing intended for the firstborn. When Esau discovers this, he is filled with distress and anger. The family is fractured further, and Jacob is forced to flee to avoid conflict. The household that carried the promise now experiences separation, fear, and displacement. Jacob travels to his relative Laban, beginning a new phase of his life marked by labor, marriage, and repeated experiences of deception. In an ironic reflection of his earlier actions, Jacob himself becomes subject to deception when Laban gives him Leah instead of Rachel in marriage. The narrative presents a pattern that is consistent with its moral structure. Actions rooted in deception often return in kind through experience. Jacob works many years, eventually marrying both Leah and Rachel and building a large household with children from multiple relationships. These children will become the foundation of what the biblical narrative later identifies as the 12 tribes of Israel. But Jacob's life is not only defined by family expansion. It is also defined by internal transformation. At a certain point in his journey, Jacob returns toward his homeland, and before reuniting with Esau, he experiences a pivotal moment alone at night. The text describes a mysterious encounter with a figure who wrestles with him until dawn. The identity of this figure is described in a way that has been interpreted in various ways within the tradition, but within the narrative itself, what is emphasized is the struggle. Jacob does not let go easily. He contends through the night until he receives a blessing. During this encounter, his name is changed to Israel, meaning one who wrestles with God. This name change is significant because it marks a shift in identity. Jacob, the one who grasped and maneuvered through life, becomes Israel, a name that represents struggle within divine encounter. The transformation is not into ease, but into a defined relationship shaped by persistence and engagement with God. After this encounter, Jacob meets Esau. Instead of destruction, reconciliation occurs. The anticipated violence does not fully materialize. The brothers separate peacefully, each going their own way. The narrative then continues with Jacob settling in the land where his father had lived. His family grows, but internal conflict continues among his children. Joseph, one of his younger sons, becomes the focus of tension due to favoritism and dreams that suggest future authority. Joseph's brothers grow resentful and eventually sell him into slavery, telling their father he has been killed. Once again, the pattern of deception and broken relationship appears within the covenant family line. Joseph is taken to Egypt, and the narrative shifts location but not theme. In Egypt, Joseph experiences a series of rises and falls. He is falsely accused and imprisoned, but eventually elevated to a position of authority due to his ability to interpret dreams. This ability becomes significant when Egypt experiences a series of dreams that no one can interpret. Joseph is brought before Pharaoh and explains that the dreams indicate coming years of abundance followed by severe famine. He is placed in authority to prepare Egypt for this coming crisis. When famine spreads, Joseph's brothers eventually come to Egypt seeking food. They do not recognize him at first. Through a series of interactions, Joseph eventually reveals his identity, and what was intended for harm becomes the pathway for preservation. He tells them that what they meant for evil, God used for good, to preserve life during famine. This moment becomes one of the key theological summaries in the narrative so far. It does not deny human wrongdoing. It does not minimize deception or betrayal, but it places those actions within a larger framework of providence that continues the covenant line through unexpected paths. Jacob and his family move to Egypt, where they are preserved during the famine. The covenant line is now relocated outside the land originally promised, showing again that geography does not limit the continuation of the promise. But the narrative also signals that this is not permanent settlement. It is preservation during crisis, not final destination. As time passes, Joseph dies, and a new generation arises in Egypt. The memory of the covenant begins to fade in the larger Egyptian context. The descendants of Jacob multiply, becoming a large population within a foreign land. And with that expansion, a new stage of the biblical narrative begins to form. Transition from family to nation, from household to people, from preservation to oppression. After Joseph's death, the story does not immediately remain calm. Time passes in Egypt, and with time comes a shift that is almost always present in the biblical pattern. Memory fades and perception changes. What once was welcomed preservation becomes, in a new political and social context. viewed as a threat. The descendants of Jacob multiply. What began as a family becomes a large people group living within the land of Egypt. They are no longer a small household dependent on Joseph's position. They are now numerous, visible, and growing. And this growth creates fear in a new Egyptian generation that no longer remembers Joseph's contribution to the nation. The narrative describes a king arising who does not know Joseph. That detail is not just historical, it is structural in the story. Forgetting becomes the background condition for oppression to begin. Because when gratitude disappears, suspicion takes its place. The new ruler looks at the Israelites and sees population growth. He sees potential strength. He sees what he interprets as a possible internal threat. And so a strategy is formed not based on justice, but on control. The people of Israel are subjected to forced labor. Their lives become defined by construction projects, brick-making, and heavy service. The same brick imagery that once appeared at Babel now reappears in Egypt, connecting the narrative across time. Humanity again builds structures under compulsion, but this time not for self-exaltation, but under oppression. The oppression intensifies. Taskmasters are placed over them. Burdens increase. Yet paradoxically, the more they are oppressed, the more they multiply. The narrative emphasizes this tension. External pressure does not eliminate them. It expands them. This creates fear in the ruling system, leading to harsher measures. Eventually, a decree is introduced targeting the male children. The idea is simple in its brutality. Control future growth by removing future generations. This is where the story becomes darker, because it moves from oppression into targeted destruction of life at its earliest stage. But even here, resistance appears. Midwives are instructed to carry out the decree, but they refuse to comply fully, fearing God more than the command of the king. Their resistance is subtle but significant. It shows that even within systems of oppression, moral resistance can exist in quiet forms. Still, the pressure continues, and eventually, a child is born who will become central to the entire trajectory of the narrative. A son is born to a Levite family. At a time when male children are under threat, his birth already carries risk. For a period, he is hidden, but eventually, his mother places him in a basket and sets him along the Nile River, entrusting his fate beyond her immediate control. The imagery is fragile but deliberate. A child placed into a river associated with both life and danger, carried by currents outside human control, yet not abandoned in meaning. The child is discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. Instead of being destroyed, he is taken into the royal household. Ironically, the very system that ordered the destruction of Hebrew male children becomes the environment where the deliverer is raised. He is named Moses. The narrative now begins to move toward transformation. Moses grows up with awareness of both Egyptian royal identity and Hebrew heritage. At some point, he witnesses an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. He intervenes and kills the Egyptian, then hides the body. This act forces him into exile. He flees into the wilderness, leaving behind the Egyptian court and entering a new phase of life far removed from power and structure. He becomes a shepherd in Midian. For years, his life remains distant from Egypt, from Israel, and from any visible connection to the earlier promise. It appears as if his story has moved into obscurity. But in the biblical narrative, obscurity is often the place where preparation happens. One day, while tending sheep, Moses encounters something unusual, a bush that burns without being consumed. This moment becomes one of the defining encounters in the entire biblical story. From within the bush, God speaks. The message is not abstract. It is direct. Moses is called by name. He is told to remove his sandals because the ground is holy. This establishes a shift in space perception. Ordinary wilderness becomes sacred space through divine presence. Moses is commissioned to return to Egypt and confront Pharaoh. He is told that he will lead the Israelites out of slavery. But Moses hesitates. He questions his ability, his authority, his speech. The narrative presents him not as confident hero, but as reluctant messenger. This reluctance becomes part of the pattern. Throughout the biblical narrative, key figures are not chosen because they already appear capable in human terms. They're chosen in contexts where reliance on divine empowerment becomes necessary. Moses returns to Egypt. He approaches Pharaoh and delivers a simple message: let the people go. Pharaoh refuses. And what follows is one of the most well-known sequences in ancient biblical history, a series of escalating judgments often referred to as plagues. Each confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh is not merely political negotiation. In the narrative structure, it is a demonstration of authority. Pharaoh represents imperial power rooted in human system and perceived divine status. Moses represents delegated authority from the God of Israel. The plagues begin to unfold in increasing intensity. Water is turned to blood. Natural systems are disrupted. Livelihoods are affected. Darkness falls over the land. Livestock suffer. The structure of Egyptian stability begins to break down in stages. Each event is also described in a way that directly challenges the perceived gods and systems of Egypt. The narrative is not just about liberation. It is about confrontation between competing claims of authority. Yet Pharaoh's resistance continues. Even when pressure increases, he hardens his stance. The narrative repeatedly emphasizes this hardening, showing a pattern where resistance to truth becomes self-reinforcing. The final and most severe judgment involves the death of the firstborn. This moment marks a decisive turning point. A ritual is introduced for the Israelites involving sacrifice and marking of doorways, so that judgment passes over their homes. This becomes the origin of what is later called Passover. The symbolism is layered. Death passes through the land, but certain homes are marked and preserved. Judgment and preservation exist simultaneously in the same environment, separated by response to instruction. After this event, Pharaoh finally allows the Israelites to leave. The people depart from Egypt. They move out of slavery into freedom, carrying with them both physical possessions and the memory of oppression. The Exodus becomes a defining identity moment in the biblical narrative. They are no longer just descendants of Jacob. They are a liberated people shaped by deliverance. But the journey is not simple transition into peace. Very quickly, they find themselves at the edge of the sea, with Pharaoh's army pursuing them. This moment creates a crisis. Behind them is military force. Before them is water. Around them is no clear path forward. And here, the narrative reaches another major turning point. Moses raises his staff. The waters divide. The people cross on dry ground. The pursuing army attempts to follow, but is overwhelmed when the waters return. This event becomes one of the foundational deliverance narratives of the entire biblical tradition. It represents not just escape, but transformation from captivity into covenant identity. After crossing, the people enter the wilderness. And here, a new phase begins. Freedom is no longer just escape from oppression. It becomes a process of formation. In the wilderness, they receive instruction, provision, and structure. They are given laws that define community life, justice, worship, and relationship with God. The covenant that was promised to Abraham now takes formal shape through national identity. The mountain of Sinai becomes a central moment in this stage of the narrative. Moses ascends the mountain, and the people witness signs of divine presence: fire, cloud, sound, and trembling. The giving of the law establishes a framework for life that is meant to distinguish them from surrounding nations. But even in this moment of revelation, instability appears. While Moses is on the mountain, the people create a golden calf, an image representing divine power that they can see and control. This act reflects again the recurring pattern, turning away from unseen trust toward visible substitutes. It mirrors earlier rebellion patterns, the desire to define authority in tangible, controllable forms rather than submitting to unseen divine instruction. Moses returns, and conflict emerges within the camp. Yet the covenant is renewed. The relationship continues, though marked by tension between instruction and failure. As the wilderness journey continues, the people struggle repeatedly with trust. They complain about food, water, direction, and leadership. Provision is given through miraculous means, yet doubt persists. The narrative emphasizes a recurring cycle: provision, forgetting, complaint, correction, and renewed provision. Eventually, the generation that left Egypt does not enter the promised land due to sustained disobedience and lack of trust. A new generation rises under leadership of Joshua, who leads them across the Jordan into the land promised to Abraham generations earlier. This moment closes a major chapter of the story: slavery in Egypt, deliverance through Moses, formation in the wilderness, and entry into the land. But it also opens the next stage of the ongoing narrative: settlement in the land, cycles of faithfulness and rebellion, judges, kings, and the continued unfolding of the ancient conflict between human disobedience and divine purpose. After Joshua leads the people across the Jordan and the land begins to be occupied, the narrative shifts from large-scale movement to settlement. The tribes of Israel receive their portions of land, and for the first time since Egypt, they are no longer a wandering people. They are now a people with territory, inheritance, and boundaries. But possession of land does not automatically produce stability of heart. The biblical narrative quickly introduces a recurring pattern that defines this entire era. When the people remain faithful to the covenant, there is peace. When they turn away, instability follows. And when instability reaches a breaking point, oppression arises from surrounding nations. This cycle repeats multiple times, almost like a structured rhythm within the narrative itself. The key idea is not geographical possession, but spiritual orientation. When the generation that directly experienced the wilderness and conquest passes away, a new generation arises that does not retain the same memory of deliverance. And as memory weakens, dependence shifts. The text emphasizes a phrase that becomes central to this period: everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That statement captures the moral condition of the era. Authority is no longer unified under covenant instruction. Instead, moral decision-making becomes decentralized, subjective, and reactive. And this internal fragmentation produces external consequences. Surrounding nations begin to exert pressure. Groups such as the Midianites, Philistines, Moabites, and others become instruments of oppression within the narrative. The people of Israel experience cycles of defeat, hardship, and subjugation. But the structure of the biblical narrative introduces a repeated response pattern. When oppression becomes severe, the people cry out. And when they cry out, deliverance is raised. This is where the period of the judges begins. Judges are not kings. They are not hereditary rulers. They are individuals raised in specific moments to address specific crises. Their authority is temporary, situational, and tied to deliverance rather than permanent governance. The first major deliverer in this cycle is Othniel, who emerges to confront oppression and restore stability for a time. After him comes Ehud, who is left-handed and uses unconventional strategy to deliver Israel from Moabite control. His story is marked by unexpected method rather than conventional warfare, showing that deliverance in this period often comes through unlikely means. Then comes Deborah, a prophetess and judge, who holds authority in a time when leadership is not confined to expected social structures. Her partnership with Barak leads to military victory against Sisera, and the narrative introduces another recurring theme. Victory often comes through cooperation and divine timing rather than sheer military strength. In that story, the final blow is delivered not by the commanding general, but by Jael, a woman who kills Sisera while he seeks refuge. The narrative consistently disrupts expectations about who can be an instrument of deliverance. After Deborah's time, the cycle continues. Again, the people fall into disobedience. Again, oppression follows. And again, a deliverer is raised. This time, the narrative focuses on Gideon. Gideon is introduced not as a powerful warrior, but as someone who is hiding while threshing wheat. His environment reflects fear and insecurity rather than confidence. When he is called, he questions his ability and even his identity. The response given to him is not based on his current condition, but on what he will become under divine commission. Gideon is instructed to reduce the size of his army dramatically before confronting the opposing Midianite forces. The reduction is intentional within the narrative. It removes the possibility of attributing victory to human strength. The final victory comes through a very small group, ensuring that the outcome is interpreted as deliverance rather than military superiority. The Midianite forces are defeated, but Gideon's story also reveals a recurring tension in this era. Even after deliverance, stability does not last long. After Gideon comes Jephthah, whose story is marked by both victory and personal tragedy. He leads Israel against the Ammonites, but his narrative also contains a vow that leads to deep personal consequence. The complexity of his story reflects the moral and emotional complexity of this period overall. Then comes Samson. Samson is perhaps one of the most paradoxical figures in the entire Judges narrative. From the beginning, he is set apart with a unique calling. He is associated with strength beyond normal human capacity, and his life is marked by confrontation with the Philistines. But Samson's strength is intertwined with personal instability. His choices repeatedly place him in compromising situations. He defeats enemies in dramatic ways, yet his internal discipline is inconsistent. His relationship with Delilah becomes a turning point. Through persistent questioning and emotional pressure, he eventually reveals the source of his consecration. His strength is tied to a vow symbolized by his uncut hair. When this vow is broken, his strength leaves him. He is captured, blinded, and humiliated. Yet even in his final moments, the narrative presents a final act of strength. In a Philistine temple, Samson brings down the structure, resulting in the death of many of his captors, even at the cost of his own life. Samson's story closes the Judges period with intensity rather than resolution. It does not present a clean transition into stability. Instead, it highlights how fragmented leadership and recurring disobedience produce cycles that intensify over time. At the end of this period, the narrative provides a summarizing reflection. There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. This statement serves as a bridge into the next major phase of the biblical narrative, the transition from judges to monarchy. But before monarchy begins, the narrative briefly focuses on a smaller, quieter story that becomes unexpectedly significant. A woman named Ruth enters the story during the time of the Judges. She is not originally from Israel, but from Moab. Through hardship and loss, she remains loyal to her Israelite mother-in-law, Naomi. Ruth's story is not defined by national conflict or military deliverance. It is defined by loyalty, provision, and quiet providence. She works in fields to gather grain and eventually comes into contact with Boaz, a relative of Naomi's deceased husband. Boaz acts as a redeemer figure, providing protection and ultimately marrying Ruth. Through this union, Ruth becomes part of the lineage that will later lead to King David. This detail is crucial in a larger narrative structure. In the midst of chaos, instability, and repeated failure, the story introduces a line of quiet preservation. The covenant promise is not only carried through judges and battles, but also through ordinary acts of loyalty and redemption. Ruth and Boaz have a son named Obed, who becomes the grandfather of David. And with that, the narrative moves toward a new era. After the repeated cycles of the Judges era, the narrative tension builds toward a structural change. Israel is no longer a loose confederation of tribes responding to crisis through temporary leaders. The pressure of surrounding nations, combined with internal instability, creates a growing desire for permanent centralized authority. The request is presented to the prophet Samuel. The people ask for a king like the other nations. This request is not simply administrative. In the narrative logic of the text, it represents a shift in how authority is understood. Up to this point, leadership in Israel has been directly tied to divine instruction and crisis-based deliverance. Now the desire is for institutional stability modeled after surrounding political systems. Samuel is troubled by the request, and he brings it before God. The response he receives is significant. The issue is not only political preference, but rejection of divine kingship in favor of human monarchy. Still, the request is granted. A king is chosen. Saul becomes the first king of Israel. Saul's introduction is initially framed with promising qualities. He is described as physically impressive, standing out among the people. He appears suitable for kingship in a conventional sense. At the beginning of his reign, there are moments of military success and national unification. However, the narrative begins to show a gradual internal instability in Saul's leadership. His decisions increasingly reflect impulsiveness, insecurity, and partial obedience to divine instruction. A key turning point occurs when Saul fails to fully carry out a commanded action during a military campaign. Instead of complete obedience, he makes partial decisions based on immediate reasoning. When confronted by Samuel, Saul attempts to justify his actions through practical explanation and external pressure. But in the structure of the narrative, obedience is not measured by intention alone, but by alignment with instruction. Samuel delivers a defining statement that becomes one of the central themes of the monarchy narrative. Obedience is better than sacrifice. This moment marks a shift. Saul's authority begins to weaken not because of external enemies, but because of internal disqualification within the narrative's theological framework. Eventually, Saul is told that his dynasty will not continue. Another will be chosen. At the same time, the narrative introduces a new figure in a quiet and unexpected way. David enters the story not as a warrior or political leader, but as a shepherd. He is the youngest of his family, not initially considered significant in terms of leadership potential. When Samuel is sent to anoint a new king from the sons of Jesse, the older brothers are presented first, but none of them are chosen. The key statement in this moment is that human evaluation focuses on outward appearance, but divine evaluation focuses on the heart. David is eventually brought in from tending sheep, and he is anointed as the future king of Israel. But his rise is not immediate. Saul remains on the throne, and David enters a long, transitional period marked by both favor and danger. One of the most well-known episodes in this phase is David's confrontation with Goliath, a Philistine warrior of immense size and strength. The narrative emphasizes the imbalance between the two sides. On one side is a trained warrior representing a military system. On the other is a young shepherd armed with simple tools. David's confidence is not rooted in military capability, but in prior experiences of deliverance and trust in divine support. He defeats Goliath with a sling and a stone. This moment becomes symbolic within the broader narrative. It represents the reversal of expected power structures. Victory does not follow conventional strength. It follows alignment with purpose and trust. However, David's victory also introduces tension. Saul becomes increasingly threatened by David's growing popularity. What begins as admiration turns into jealousy. Saul's instability deepens, and David is forced into exile, spending years moving through wilderness regions, caves, and foreign territories while avoiding pursuit. During this time, David gathers followers, not elite officials or established leaders, but individuals described as distressed, indebted, and discontented. This group becomes the early foundation of his future leadership circle. The narrative presents David not as immediately installed king, but as a tested figure shaped through prolonged pressure, delay, and uncertainty. Even when opportunities arise for David to harm Saul and take the throne by force, he refuses. He consistently avoids taking authority through illegitimate means, even when circumstances appear to justify it. This restraint becomes a defining feature of his character within the narrative structure. Eventually, Saul's reign comes to a tragic end in battle against the Philistines. With his death, the path is open for David to assume kingship. But even then, transition is not immediate or unified. There is division within the nation. David first becomes king over Judah, while Saul's remaining house experiences conflict over leadership. Only later does David become king over all Israel. unifying the tribes under his rule. Jerusalem becomes the central city of the kingdom. David establishes it as both political and spiritual center. The Ark of the Covenant, representing divine presence among the people, is brought into the city, reinforcing the connection between kingship and covenant identity. David's reign is marked by both strength and complexity. He expands the kingdom, defeats surrounding enemies, and establishes national stability. Yet his story also contains significant moral failure, particularly in the episode involving Bathsheba and Uriah. This event introduces consequences that ripple through his household. Although forgiveness and restoration are part of the narrative, internal conflict within David's family increases significantly afterward. One of his sons, Absalom, eventually rebels against him, leading to a civil conflict that forces David to flee Jerusalem temporarily. The rebellion is eventually suppressed, but the emotional and relational damage within the royal family remains part of the narrative legacy. Despite these challenges, David remains a central figure in the biblical story. He is described as a man after God's own heart, not because of perfection, but because of sustained orientation toward repentance and alignment after failure. Toward the end of David's life, preparations begin for the construction of a permanent temple. Although David desires to build it himself, he is told that the task will be carried out by his son. That son is Solomon. With this transition, the narrative moves into a new phase, the height of united monarchy, characterized by wisdom, wealth, expansion, and eventual internal decline. After David's final years and the passing of authority to Solomon, the narrative enters a new phase that is often described as the peak of Israel's united kingdom. It is a period marked by unprecedented wealth, stability, international recognition, and the fulfillment of long-standing national aspirations that have been forming since the time of Abraham. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, the same structural tension that has followed the story from the beginning continues to exist. The question of whether human leadership can sustain covenant faithfulness without gradual internal drift. Solomon begins his reign with a moment that defines the tone of his early rule. He is offered an opportunity to ask for anything. Instead of requesting military expansion, wealth, or the elimination of enemies, he asks for wisdom. This request aligns with the responsibility he has inherited. He is now king over a unified nation that spans multiple tribes, regions, and interests. Governance requires judgment, discernment, and the ability to navigate complexity. The narrative emphasizes that this request is pleasing because it is not self-centered in the usual political sense. It prioritizes governance over personal gain. As a result, Solomon receives not only wisdom, but also wealth and honor in addition. Very early in his reign, this wisdom is demonstrated in a well-known case involving two women claiming the same child. Solomon proposes a solution that reveals the true emotional connection between the child and the claimant. The judgment is not based on evidence alone, but on insight into human nature. This event establishes Solomon's reputation for discernment throughout the kingdom. As his rule stabilizes, the nation experiences expansion. Trade increases. Diplomatic relations develop with surrounding kingdoms. Israel transitions from a regional tribal entity into a recognized political and economic power within the ancient Near Eastern world. One of the most significant external interactions during this time is the visit of the Queen of Sheba. She comes with questions, wealth, and curiosity about the reports she has heard concerning Solomon's wisdom and the prosperity of his kingdom. When she arrives, she observes the structure of the kingdom, the organization of its leadership, and the clarity of its systems. She is described as being overwhelmed by what she witnesses, acknowledging that what she had heard was only a fraction of what she now sees. This moment represents international recognition of Israel's peak status. At the center of Solomon's reign is the construction of the temple. This project is presented as the fulfillment of a long-standing desire that began with David. The temple becomes the permanent dwelling place for the symbolic presence of God among the people. It replaces the portable structure of the wilderness period and the temporary arrangements of earlier generations. The construction is detailed, structured, and extensive. Materials are gathered from across regions. Skilled labor is organized. The design follows specific patterns that reflect continuity with earlier sacred instructions given during the wilderness period. When the temple is completed, a significant moment occurs during its dedication. The presence associated with divine glory is described as filling the space in such a way that the priests are unable to continue their duties for a time. The narrative emphasizes overwhelming presence rather than architectural achievement. This moment represents the high point of a united monarchy, a stable kingdom, centralized worship, and a recognized connection between leadership and divine presence. But even at this peak, the narrative begins to introduce subtle signs of imbalance. Solomon's governance expands in complexity. To maintain his kingdom, he builds administrative structures that require resources. Large-scale projects continue beyond the temple, including palaces, infrastructure, and fortified cities. To support this expansion, taxation and labor demands increase. The same people who experienced liberation from forced labor in Egypt are now participating in large state-driven construction projects under heavy obligation. The narrative begins to quietly echo earlier patterns from Egypt, not as direct repetition, but as structural similarity. Another development emerges in Solomon's life. Extensive foreign alliances formed through marriage. These alliances are politically strategic, connecting Israel to surrounding nations. However, they also introduce external cultural and religious influences into the internal structure of the kingdom. Over time, the narrative indicates a gradual shift in Solomon's internal orientation. The wisdom that marked his early reign begins to coexist with compromise. Foreign influences are no longer merely diplomatic. They become embedded within royal life. Solomon begins to tolerate and eventually participate in practices associated with other deities introduced through his marriages. The narrative does not present an abrupt fall, but a gradual turning. The language of the text emphasizes his heart was turned. This is important because it reflects a consistent theme throughout the entire story so far. The central issue is not external pressure alone, but internal direction. Because of this turning, the narrative introduces a divine declaration that the kingdom will not remain fully unified after Solomon's reign. The consequences will not occur immediately, but they are established as future reality. Still, during Solomon's lifetime, the kingdom maintains outward stability. Wealth continues. Trade remains strong. Influence expands. But internally, foundational tension is developing. As Solomon's reign concludes, his son Rehoboam is positioned to succeed him. However, at this same moment, another figure emerges in the narrative, Jeroboam, an official who had served under Solomon and had received earlier prophetic indication that he would have a future role in leadership over part of the kingdom. When Solomon dies, the transition of power becomes a critical moment. The people of Israel approach Rehoboam with a request. They ask for relief from the heavy burdens placed upon them during Solomon's reign. They seek a lighter governance structure, reduced labor demands, and a more sustainable national system. Rehoboam consults two groups of advisors. The older advisors recommend listening to the people and easing the burden. The younger advisors recommend asserting authority more strictly to maintain control. Rehoboam chooses the latter approach. This decision becomes the turning point that fractures the United Kingdom. The northern tribes reject Rehoboam's rule and declare separation. Only the southern region, primarily Judah and Benjamin, remains under his authority. Jeroboam becomes king over the northern tribes. At this moment, the united monarchy divides into two separate kingdoms. The northern kingdom, often referred to as Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. This division is not merely political. It represents a structural fragmentation of identity, governance, and religious centralization. In an attempt to prevent the northern population from returning to Jerusalem for worship, Jeroboam introduces alternative worship centers and symbols. These changes are presented as political stabilization measures, but within the narrative, they're also described as deviations from earlier covenant instruction. From this point forward, the story of Israel and Judah runs in parallel lines. Two kingdoms, sharing a common origin, now move through history with separate leadership, separate political trajectories, and recurring cycles of conflict, reform, and decline. In the north, kings rise and fall with frequent instability. Dynasties are short-lived. Power shifts often through conflict rather than peaceful succession. In the south, the line of David continues, maintaining a single dynastic thread, though not without its own failures and internal challenges. Throughout both kingdoms, a recurring pattern emerges. Prophetic voices arise to confront leadership, call people back to covenant faithfulness, and warn of consequences tied to persistent deviation. These prophets do not operate within political structures. They function as external moral and spiritual voices, often standing in opposition to kings and state systems. One of the earliest and most prominent of these prophetic figures is Elijah. Elijah appears in the northern kingdom during the reign of Ahab, a king whose rule is marked by intensified idolatry influenced by his marriage to Jezebel. Under this influence, worship practices shift significantly away from earlier covenant patterns. Elijah's confrontation with this system becomes one of the defining narratives of the prophetic tradition. He declares a drought over the land, challenges the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and demonstrates a decisive confrontation between competing claims of divine authority. On Mount Carmel, a public demonstration is arranged to determine which deity is truly active. Sacrifices are prepared, and the prophets of Baal call upon their God without response. Elijah then calls upon the God of Israel, and fire descends in response, consuming the offering. This event reasserts, within the narrative, the central claim that has been present since the beginning. Authority is not distributed equally among competing powers. There is a distinction between created systems and the source of all existence. Despite this moment of dramatic confrontation, the broader pattern of instability continues. Elijah himself experiences fear, exhaustion, and withdrawal after his victory. The narrative does not portray prophetic life as continuous triumph, but as a mixture of confrontation and vulnerability. He is later taken from the earth in a dramatic departure, and his prophetic mantle is passed to Elisha, who continues similar work within the northern kingdom. Meanwhile, both Israel and Judah continue to experience cycles of reform and decline. Some kings attempt partial restoration of covenant practices, while others intensify deviation. Prophets continue to speak, warning that persistent systemic failure will eventually lead to national consequences, including exile. As this prophetic warning grows, the narrative begins to move toward a larger horizon. The division of the kingdom is no longer just a political split. It becomes a prolonged historical trajectory that leads both nations toward eventual collapse under external empires. But even within this trajectory of decline, the prophetic message consistently maintains a dual structure, warning and hope. Judgment is announced, but restoration is also promised beyond judgment. The story now moves toward the final stages of the kingdoms, where Syria and Babylon begin to rise as dominant imperial powers, and where exile becomes the next major turning point in the ancient biblical narrative. After the era of Elijah and Elisha, the warning spoken through the prophets begins to unfold on a national scale. The message has been consistent for generations. If the covenant is repeatedly abandoned, consequences will come in the form of displacement and foreign domination. What begins as warning now becomes historical reality. The northern kingdom, Israel, is the first to fall. The Assyrian Empire rises as a dominant force in the ancient Near East. It expands with military strength, absorbing smaller nations and enforcing control through conquest and deportation. Israel, weakened by internal instability, shifting dynasties, and persistent political fragmentation, becomes vulnerable. Eventually, Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, is captured. The Assyrians deport large portions of the population. The northern tribes are dispersed among foreign territories. This moment marks the end of the northern kingdom as a distinct political entity. In the narrative logic of the biblical story, this is not only a geopolitical collapse. It is also described as covenant consequence unfolding through history. The identity of the people is disrupted through exile, scattering, and assimilation. The southern kingdom, Judah, remains. But Judah is not stable. It continues for a time under the line of David, yet it follows the same recurring pattern seen throughout the entire story. Periods of reform followed by decline. Kings arise who attempt restoration. Some remove idolatrous practices and return to earlier covenant instructions. Others intensify deviation and align with surrounding imperial cultures. Prophets continue to speak throughout this period. Voices such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and others emerge, each addressing different moments within the same trajectory. Their message is consistent in structure: return, warning, consequence, and hope beyond judgment. One of the most significant prophetic voices during this time is Jeremiah. He speaks during the final decades of Judah's existence, warning that Babylon will become the instrument of judgment. His message is not received favorably by political leadership, but it remains persistent. Eventually, as Assyria declines, a new empire rises, Babylon. Babylon becomes the dominant imperial power in the region. Under its expansion, Judah becomes a vassal state and eventually rebels. This rebellion triggers military response. The city of Jerusalem is besieged. The temple built under Solomon, once the central symbol of national identity and divine presence among the people, is destroyed. Its vessels are taken. Its structure is dismantled. This moment represents one of the most significant collapses in the entire biblical narrative. The royal line of Judah is removed from the throne. The population is deported to Babylon. Exile begins. This period is not simply geographical displacement. It is described as a deep identity crisis. The people who once had land, temple, and monarchy now find themselves in a foreign empire, disconnected from the structures that define their national and religious life. But even in exile, the narrative does not end. In Babylon, new prophetic voices arise. Ezekiel speaks of visions of restoration, symbolic representations of renewal, and the idea that divine presence is not confined to a single location. Daniel emerges in the royal court of Babylon, living within the imperial system while maintaining distinct identity and integrity. The exile becomes a paradoxical space: loss of land, but preservation of identity; destruction of temple, but development of text, reflection, and reinterpretation of covenant. After decades pass, a new empire rises again: Persia. The Persian king Cyrus issues a decree allowing exiled peoples to return to their homelands. This includes the descendants of Judah. The return from exile begins. Groups led by figures such as Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah return to Jerusalem in stages. The temple is rebuilt, though on a smaller scale than Solomon's original structure. The city walls are restored. Religious instruction is reestablished. The community is reorganized around written law and renewed identity. However, something is different. There is no independent monarchy. The Davidic throne is not restored in political form. The people exist under foreign imperial oversight, first Persia, then later Greece, and eventually Rome. This period becomes known as the post-exilic or Second Temple period. Over time, expectations begin to develop around restoration. Prophetic writings and interpretations create anticipation of a future figure who will restore the kingdom in a deeper sense than before. The language of promise, kingship, and deliverance begins to take on a future orientation. Then, after centuries of imperial rule under successive empires, a new figure enters the narrative in a quiet and unexpected way. Jesus of Nazareth appears within the historical context of Roman-occupied Judea. His arrival is not presented in political terms, but in relational and spiritual terms. He teaches, heals, and speaks about the kingdom of God in ways that reinterpret earlier covenant themes. His message centers on restoration, forgiveness, and the inbreaking of divine rule, not through political conquest, but through transformation of human life. His ministry challenges existing religious and political structures. He gathers followers, teaches in parables, and engages with both common people and leaders. Eventually, this leads to confrontation with religious authorities and Roman governance. He is arrested, tried, and executed by crucifixion under Roman authority. In the narrative logic of the biblical text, this moment appears as defeat, but is simultaneously presented as fulfillment of deeper purpose. The crucifixion becomes the central turning point in the Christian interpretation of the entire story. After his death, his followers report that he rises from the dead. This event becomes the foundation of the resurrection narrative. It redefines the meaning of death, victory, and restoration within the story. The defeat of the serpent motif that began in Genesis is understood by Christian interpretation as being decisively addressed here, not through political revolution, but through spiritual and redemptive fulfillment. After the resurrection, his followers begin to spread his teachings throughout the Roman Empire. This movement expands rapidly despite persecution. Communities form across regions, carrying forward the message of the kingdom. A key figure in this expansion is Paul, who travels extensively, writing letters and establishing communities. His writings interpret earlier biblical history as leading toward this moment of fulfillment. Over time, Christianity transitions from a small movement within Judea into a widespread faith across the Roman world. Despite persecution, the movement continues to grow. Eventually, under Roman Emperor Constantine, Christianity becomes legally recognized within the empire. Over centuries, it becomes a central religious force in Western and Near Eastern history. But the narrative that began in the earliest chapters of Genesis does not conclude simply with institutional expansion. It is framed around expectation of final restoration, where justice, peace, and renewal are fully realized. The final vision presented in the biblical narrative, particularly in Revelation, returns again to symbolic imagery. Conflict resolved, death removed, and creation restored. The serpent, whose presence began the conflict in Eden, is described as ultimately defeated and removed. The imagery of a new heaven and new earth presents a restored creation where division, exile, and death are no longer present. The story that began with a garden ends with a renewed creation. From the initial rebellion described in symbolic heavenly language, through human history marked by exile, kingdom, prophecy, collapse, and restoration, the narrative maintains a continuous thread. Conflict between autonomy and divine order, followed by a long process of redemption and restoration. And in its final form, the story closes not with ongoing struggle, but with resolution. The movement from garden lost to garden restored completes the arc. This is where the narrative ends,